All right. So as I was saying, torque is produced with the force applied to the bar and the moment arm, right? So where this bar is located is going to change our moment arm, as whereas also, like I said, where our hips are located. If they are higher, our center of mass, our axis changes, and that moment arm about the hips is lengthened, which means that now we have to produce more force to bring those hips through. Same thing if we let that bar get away from our body. Now we have also lengthened that moment arm about the hips, which means that, again, more force to bring the hips through, as well as now the smaller muscles of our upper back, traps, rhomboids and all that, they are smaller than your quads, glutes, and hamstrings. Now they have to keep that bar from toppling us over, right? So those stabilizers become really important, especially if we let the bar get away from us. So that's why we want to keep the bar close to our body. It's going to not just shorten the distance, but change that moment arm, which is also going to potentially change the velocity, our angular velocity, right? So the way this lift starts is with knee extension. Quads and the glutes start to extend. So that's where we produce torque, get the bar off the ground. And then torque has to be produced, like I said, in those mid-traps, rhomboids, levator scapulus, etc., to overcome that toppling force. So that's, again, I'm repeating that because that's important. Keep the bar closer to your center of gravity or center of mass. Keep it pulled close right over the midfoot, and then pull it into your shins and along your quads as you complete the lift. Because if you don't, then now where that weight's located can pull us down and forward, right? Makes sense. Torque also has to be produced in our carpals. So we have to produce enough torque about the moment arm of the carpals, right? Which can go up into our brachialis and our brachioradialis. But with the double pronated grip, like we've talked about, we're not doing an over-under because that's going to put too much pressure on the bicep, but they're still going to contract here with our arms straight, right? Whenever we flex those flexors, the carpal flexors, and that's essentially whenever we produce that torque. If we bend the arms, then that's actually going to potentially cause an injury about the elbow. So we don't want to do that. Keep them straight. We got to keep torque. Got to keep it nice and tight around the fingers. Grip is going to become important here. After that, angular velocity and angular displacement. So angular impulse is a product derived from the net torque. The change in the net torque and the change in time over or is equal to the change in angular momentum. Angular momentum is made up of your moment arm and your angular velocity, right? So again, we've talked about lengthening the moment arm means that we're going to have to produce more force to overcome that torque, right? And that's also going to affect our angular momentum as well as our angular velocity. So if our angular displacement and our angular velocity, if angular displacement is greater, and that, again, that change in time is probably going to be greater with a large amount of force, our angular velocity is going to essentially slow down, which means that as I bring my hips through, I might hit that sticking point where I bring my hips to full extension from the knee pass all the way to the lockout, could affect the completion of the lift. If my angular velocity hits 0 and my hips stop moving forward, then I'm just going to drop the weight or hurt myself. So a greater angular displacement, velocity, momentum, and impulse affect the moving force, right? Okay. So, and also so does the change in time. Change in time is huge, but that's going to be, like I said, directly related to our angular velocity, because if we're moving slow, that means that the change in time is going to be slow. So what we want is a greater range of motion, right? That's going to help us create faster angular velocities and going to give us a greater momentum and impulse. Again, there's still impulse momentum relationship here. This helps us overcome the sticking point of the bar and extend our hips, knees, and lumbar spine to lock out, right? So, again, here is this picture, wonderful, trying to connect the dots and make sense of all this. It's extremely, these go all over the place because they, force, velocity, and displacement are all three very intricately connected, and they change so many things. So that's why these three things are important, and we need to work on them. We can't really do anything about displacement in terms of anthropometrics, right? But we can in terms of, okay, do I have this bar centered over my midfoot, or is it out in front of me, which is going to affect our velocity, right? We don't want that to hit zero, but also the amount of force that we put on this bar, because it's such a great force to overcome, weight to overcome, our velocity is going to be slow, but it cannot hit zero. So now that we've talked about that, let's talk about a qualitative anatomical analysis of the deadlift. So here are muscles involved. I talked about these earlier. Hamstrings, glutes, quads, gastroc, soleus, and erector spinae are going to be our prime movers, our synergists. Our stabilizers, our antagonists, rectus abdominis, and obliques are going to keep the core tight to keep us from folding over, and so are all of these other muscles of the upper back, our traps, lats, rhomboids, levator scapula. They're going to keep us from dropping the weight down, and then of course our grip is just going to keep us from dropping the bar out of our hand. So we need to talk about stance first, and then we'll get into the actual movement. So stance, foot placement, hip to shoulder width apart, toes pointed straight ahead or slightly out, 10 to 15 degrees-ish. Midfoot, tops of the shoelaces are under the bar, and we root our feet into the ground. This is, people, the 10 to 15 degree, you may have seen powerlifters do this, but they get down there and they dig their feet into the ground. This is going to help them to begin to produce torque before they even begin to lift, right? They want their feet to be firmly planted into the ground and also start to kind of contract those glutes. Hips, knees, and spine, we're going to slightly flex our knees. We're going to hinge the hips posteriorly. Okay, so we're going to hinge the hips back. We're not going to fold at our waist. We're going to maintain a nice rigid spine, nice and upright, until tension is felt in the hamstrings, and then we're going to flex our knees and descend and grab the bar. So a big thing is our hips. They're going to be slightly inferior to the shoulders, but they're not going to be on the same plane. So we're not going to be parallel, right, with the ground, but we're also not going to be like a frog with our hips way down here and our shoulders up here. Okay, that's mechanically inefficient. We want to be about right here, maybe here, but no more than that. Hand placement. So like I said, we're doing double pronated grip because over under wrist injury of popping a bicep. So we want our hands to be thumb length from the knurling, our grip, right, the rough part. And then we're going to keep those arms straight. We're not going to bend them at all and try to get, an extra push in there, because that's going to risk injuring our humero-ulnar or humero-radial joint. And then flex carpals, close the wrists, and that's going to keep the bar steady. Back, spine, and our abdominals, our core. We want to keep the neck. We want our spine to be completely straight. So you'll hear a lot of people say, hey, keep your head up. Problem with that is now my spine's not in line. I have extra tension on my cervical extensors that doesn't need to be there. So that way, whenever I, have to contract those mid traps, those upper traps, those lats, in order to keep that bar close to my body and keep it from toppling me over, now I'm putting extra stress on my neck. I don't want to do that. I just said we want to keep those muscles of the upper and mid back engaged to avoid from rounding the shoulders, and we're going to maintain tight core, so we're going to breathe in, and that's what's going to keep our core tight throughout the lift. This right here, just some pictures. This right here is what your optimal deadlift technique wants to be. The hips are slightly inferior to the shoulders, but they're not parallel, nor are they too far down. Right here, this is just dead wrong in the middle. The hips are way too high. Our center of mass is going to relatively stay the same, somewhere about here. But now that moment arm has lengthened, meaning more force has to be produced. And it's also potentially going to hurt our back. And then here, we don't want to be in too froggy of a stance. This might not be too bad. Hips a little bit lower would be worse. But the problem with this right here is now our knee extensors, right? We have the length tension relationship where we've lengthened those quads as we flex that knee. So now we got to produce more force in the knee in order to just break the bar off the ground. So the quads have to produce more force, so do the glutes, and they are more lengthened, which means there's less tension in those muscles. So here's how we start. We got the lift off. We begin in that stance. We tighten our core, and then we push the ground away. So this is where we just start with our knee extension, right? Knee extension begins to occur with the weight distributed through the midfoot as hips and shoulders rise at the same time. So like this, okay? We don't do this and we don't do that. That's bad, right? They're going to come up and down at the same time. So this means our quads, our gastrocs and soleus are concentrically contracting. Okay, they are moving. Also our glutes, they're going to start to move us up. And as the knees and hips rise, the spine must stay neutral and the scapula must stay retracted and abducted back, right? So our mid-traps, rhomboids, and levator scapula are isometrically contracting, keeping our shoulders back. Our rectus abdominis and obliques are isometrically contracting. They're stabilizing our core to keep us from folding over. Our grip has to activate to keep the bar from rolling out of the hands, right? Bar rolls out of your hands, no good, bad lift. So all these small carpal flexors in our wrist and our forearm are going to contract isometrically. We're just going to sit there and hold it and try to keep that bar from slipping out of our hands. We want to utilize our brachioradialis and brachialis minimally, right? And that's going to help because we're double overhand. We're not like this. Next, we're passing the knees. So this is where now we're starting to, our knee extension is slowing down and we're actually going to start to bring our hips through, which means that musculature use is going to change a little bit. We begin the pull portion right here. So our hips begin to extend, our hips and our glutes bring our hips through, hamstrings and glutes and glutes are contracting concentrically. Tibialis anterior contracts to stabilize the ankle, right? Because if those gastrocs and the soleus are contracting super hard, but that anterior the tibialis isn't contracting, then we're just going to, as we come through, we're going to come up on our toe, we're going to lose our balance forward. So that stabilizes, balances us out. The weight will continue to be distributed through the midfoot, and the spine extends via concentric contraction of the lumbar erector. So they're going to help us also become more upright. Your cervical erectors are going to stay in line, keep your head in line, right? Your rectus abdominis and obliques are going to continue to keep your core tight and keep you from toppling. Mid-trap, rhomboids, and levator scapula are still contracting to keep your shoulders back, but now as the spine extends, your lats and your upper traps contract to keep that bar close to your body. So that's what's going to enable you, as you come up, those muscles are going to enable you to pull that bar down and into your body. So that way, one, obviously, again, displacement, right? It's going to keep that bar path shorter, but also it's going to keep us from the bar getting away from our body, and now we're toppling over. Grip remains contracted. Honestly, if your grip is not strong enough, though, this right here is where I would say some people may begin to experience eccentric contraction of the carpal flexors. If the weight begins to slip, if your hands begin to come undone, but you're still holding on to the bar, they are eccentrically contracting. They are slowing that bar roll down. Okay, at lockout, knees, hips, lumbar, spine are in full extension now. Now we're standing nice and upright. Shoulders are back, head still in line. Glutes, hamstrings, quads, and erector spinae bring the hips, knees, and spine to extension concentrically. We're not hyperextending. We'll talk about that in a minute. Ankles are in a neutral position. This isn't the beginning of a power clean. This isn't a power pull. We're not, coming up on our toes right there. They're in a nice neutral position. Gastroc and soleus, like that. All those ankles being stabilized at this point in order to keep from coming up on the toes, also from rocking backwards.